Welcome to another Peaceful Solution Character Education Program Teacher Certification class. Please be seated. Hope everyone's had a wonderful week, wonderful weekend as we get ready to close it out, or as we actually already closed it out in the beginning of the week here. I'm prepared for another blazer of a week here in Texas. We've got some triple digits coming to us here in the Lone Star State. I know we have a lot of people going through a lot of things right now in different places throughout the southern part, Midwest part of the United States. A lot of severe storms, big hail, heavy rain, flooding, tornadoes all over the place, So we hope that you're faring well where you are. And if you are able to, hopefully, if not now, in the future, be able to watch this class, because irregardless of how the world might seem to be crumbling around us, we always have room and the opportunity to build a positive character. And of course, if we can rebuild our society with the installation of these morals, of course we could actually have a more peaceful society, not only amongst ourselves as individuals, but even amongst the environment, which is something that we covered in the last book in regards to self-control. But we're going to see those things slowly build over time, but with time and patience, consistency and so forth, eventually we'll turn this society, this global society, around towards a more peaceful and abundant place. But we're going to continue here in Unit 4, in case you're joining us here for the first time. Hopefully, we know we have many new people joining us on a regular basis for all the classes. Word gets around, people tell their friends, they tell their family, and they hop on to these classes when they're shown on Sundays and Wednesdays. And so we do have a lot of times many first-time people watching us when we're presenting these classes. And if it's your first time, of course, welcome to the classes. We encourage you to go back and check out the previous classes for the last few years. There's quite a few classes and a lot to catch up with, in addition to what we're covering here. But on the official Peaceful Solution page, you can, on that tag post, that top post there, go to the respect unit and click the download on that particular respect unit. Of course, you can do all the other ones as well, and that'll bring you to the book that we are currently in, which is Unit 4 of the 5 intermediate series units that we're covering. And of course, we are in Chapter 5, which is responding to disrespect, and we're going to be picking up on page 128 today. Kind of where William left off. If you remember, he was talking about maintaining control, and the very last thing that he was talking about is the importance of forgiveness and all the other character traits that go along with this character trait of forgiveness, in regards to that last point that he was covering on page 127, because he was talking about maintaining control. Study these tips for keeping your composure in a difficult situation. Because remember what we're talking about here, and we'll go back and read a little bit at the very beginning there of the introduction. We're talking about how we as individuals, now we covered what respect is, respect for ourselves, respect for others, and so forth. Now we're dealing with how to respond to disrespect. You're not going to get out of dealing with disrespect, right? Like it was covered in the previous 2 classes with William and others. Not everybody is learning the Peaceful Solution. Very few people, compared to the 8 billion plus people we have in the world right now, are learning the Peaceful Solution, or even some type of character development, positive character development. They're learning to develop their character, but it's not always in a positive way. Remember, we talked about 2 categories that character that falls into, positive and negative. Well, what you find in the world is kind of like the same thing that we covered in Chapter 2 of the character unit when it talks about families. Families typically fall into a category of a mixture of positive and negative, right? And there's some dysfunctionality in the family. Well, there's some dysfunctionality, quite a bit of dysfunctionality in society as a whole. So there is no completely, totally evil, society, even though some people would like to think that another culture or society or country is totally evil. It's not that way. We know that there are values that are upheld. Sometimes we see in the news countries that are making war or having conflicts with other countries. In a lot of cases, it's because there are certain values that they hold dear, and when they see those things being infringed upon, all they know to do, because this is what they've been trained to do, is fight, is go to war. Well, that never solves the problem. There are no winners when it comes to war. Even one of the Russian president just recently said in a statement regarding the United States and NATO and their weaponry, if they bring certain of these things into the war with Ukraine, nuclear war will be an option, and there will be no winners. And he's absolutely right about that. This is that policy of mad, mutually assured destruction, where no one is going to survive, very few, if that, is going to survive after the use of nuclear weapons, because they're so catastrophic in what they do, because they're not meant to necessarily just wipe out the bad guys, right? They're weapons of mass destruction. They wipe out the masses, whether it's human masses, vegetation masses, ocean life masses, animal masses. It does not matter. It's weapons that wipe out the mass. And I think a lot of the world leaders, they know and they understand this, but because they don't have something like what we're learning right here to fall back on, they don't have any hope. They don't see any way out of their situation outside of fighting their way out. That's the only option that they can see. So like William was saying, you have to kind of go back and evaluate why people make certain decisions. Why do they make bad choices? Why do they respond with disrespect? Well, a lot of it has to do with how they were educated. How was their character developed? What did they learn in schools? What did their society teach them? What did they learn in the homes, right? Were they taught to hate other people? Were they taught to be in opposition to other people? Remember, hatred is something that's learned. War is something that's learned. Humans have a natural aversion to not destroy their own species, okay? But those things are taught, and they're taught through propaganda, they're taught through the news, they're taught through movies, radio, and so forth. But what we're learning here is that there is a way, there is a solution to resolve the differences, the problems, the conflicts that arise in society. All these problems are caused by humans, by people getting away from the moral principles that would ensure perfect peace amongst their neighbors. So all we've got to do to fix it is get back to those moral principles that will ensure perfect peace amongst the neighbors. It's kind of like diagnosing a car. Now they're a lot more difficult and complex to diagnose nowadays than what they used to be before. You could use a stethoscope and a screwdriver and a crescent wrench or something, 100 years ago to diagnose or fix a car. Now you've got to have all these fancy computers and program and software, but the basic operation of the vehicle is pretty much the same, okay? So a mechanic would know that if a customer brings their car into the shop and they're complaining that, it's hesitating under acceleration, or it's getting bad fuel economy, or it's making this it idles very roughly, right? The mechanic knows that there are certain rules or parameters that need to be met in order for that car to run smoothly, or to accelerate smoothly, or to combust properly. So all they have to do is go back to the software, computer, or their books or tech books or whatever, and see where the vehicle is supposed to be, where it's not, and then what's the cause. Fix the cause, you bring the vehicle back into the parameters, now the vehicle's running smoothly again. Well, it's kind of the same way with the problems that we see in society, a little bit more complex because you're not dealing with a fixed thing like an engine, right? People have emotions, they have opinions, they have, moods and attitudes and ideologies and so forth that you have to work to overcome. And even though you might teach somebody and show them, hey, if you follow these principles, you can actually eliminate your problems. Well, I kind of see what you're saying, but this is what I've learned growing up. This is what I've seen work, right? And so you've got to kind of build through those, not, I don't want to say bust through, but break down those barriers over a period of time, those negative barriers that would help the person learn positive character development. And it's kind of like, it was interesting, I was listening to some information about and we're going to talk a little bit about it today, hopefully we'll get into about consistency, the consistency of doing certain things. And you take something, for instance, like a nice slab of concrete or a rock, all right? And then you take something soft like a little drop of water. But over the years, if that little drop of water continues to drip down on that one spot, on that slab of concrete or that rock, eventually it's going to erode that rock. It's going to erode that concrete away. Now, you take a you take a drop of water and it hits your hand, it's not, it's no big deal. We like water. We wash up, we drink water, we use it to cook our food and so forth. But the whole point behind the thing was showing how even though the water is soft and the concrete or the rock is hard, the consistent action of that drip over and over and over and over will eventually erode that hard surface. Well, it's the same thing with eroding the hardened hearts or the hardened heads, that have been trained in immorality. Us consistently teaching over and over and over again these positive moral principles and not backing down, not changing how we act, not changing what we teach or how we think about the outcomes of these things and what they'll produce when we practice them, eventually will erode away those negative influences, just like they've been eroded away in our own hearts and minds, right? We'll be able to do that to others, and this is the power that we actually have as teachers, to be able to take what we've learned in the Peaceful Solution and effectively use it to change the hearts and the minds of those who listen to us, right? It's not an overnight thing, right? It wasn't overnight with us, but we know through our own self that it does work. So just keep those things in mind. Hopefully we'll get to that as we move forward in the lesson this evening. But William was talking about, forgiveness and not holding a grudge. Do not hold a grudge or hold on to unkind thoughts about the person. Don't treat the person badly. Learn to forgive. And that's a very I guess I want to say a powerful skill to have, because in a lot of cases it is lacking in society, because the ideology is you don't deserve my forgiveness, right? You don't deserve to be forgiven for what you've done. I hope you burn in hell. I hope you suffer what I suffered or what my loved ones suffered, or whatever the case might be. I've heard these statements, when people are angry or hurt because something terrible has occurred in their life, and that doesn't dismiss the fact that something terrible occurred. But holding on to a grudge or not forgiving a person because they made a mistake or they made a bad choice, right? It doesn't help you as an individual. Holding a grudge will lead to disrespect on your part, right? And even though you forgive a person for the wrong that they did, that doesn't mean they've immediately earned your trust back, right? Now, the respect they have, because everybody deserves respect, okay? But that doesn't mean that the trust is immediately earned. Get that, right? Trust has to be developed. It has to be earned. You have to show through consistency of particular patterns of behavior that you're not going to do the things that you did to lose that trust to begin with. Don't get that confused with forgiveness or respect or anything else like that. Remember, two wrongs never make a right. Maintain your positive values. Now, what we're talking about here in this class, this lesson, is how we as individuals and as teachers teach our students to get them to understand how they should be responding to disrespect. I want to go back here real quick to, let's see, I'm in the wrong one there, went a little bit too far, to the very first page here in our yes, in our chapter 5, under note to note to the teacher, under lesson plan 5, page A. I just wanted to read that real quick there briefly, just to refresh our minds on what we as teachers are to gain out of this lesson. So when we teach it, we can have a blueprint or a benchmark for what we're needing to get out of our students. It says here, under note to the teacher, this unit would be incomplete if it did not include a chapter on how to respond to the disrespectful behavior of others. There is no doubt that we live in a society that condones that condones all forms of disrespect. None of us, our children most of all, are immune to it. Despite the best efforts to consistently treat others with care and concern, some will respond to respect with disrespect. Therefore, an integral part of building a positive moral character is ensuring that children are taught how to handle disrespect and from others, how to handle disrespect from others in the most peaceful manner possible, right? And it is very possible to handle these situations or scenarios of disrespect peacefully, as long as you've been taught, that person's been taught, and they're willing to practice, right? And it's a twofold thing. The external, that is something coming to them from outside, being taught to them, and an internal, a willingness, a desire to be peaceful, to practice peace, to not bring harm to anyone else, to have enough care and consideration and concern to, stop and think before they actually open their mouth and say something that could escalate an already pending conflict and make it even bigger, or even say something that could totally, crush another person, just because they can say it, right? Whether it's truth or false, or whatever the case might be. A person who has enough care and consideration will stop and think, what is the best outcome? What was the best solution in this case? What is the peaceful solution in this case? It says people today have been influenced to think that the problem of disrespect can be solved with more disrespect. And this takes us back to what I was talking about at the very beginning. They've been influenced. Well, why do countries think this? Right? This isn't down to just an individual thing with family members or school or the workplace. Countries are run by people, right? They're run by leaders who have been influenced, who have certain characteristics developed within them, who had the same thing that we covered in the character unit, the values, the influences, the choices, right? All those things, their environment, all that help to shape their character, and it is a part of how they make their decisions. Their character determines the decisions that they're going to make, whether they're positive or negative, whether they're harmful or helpful, to themselves, others, and the environment. So this is what we're saying here. This is an influence that people have to think that the problem of disrespect can be solved with more disrespect. And as we're learning here, that is not the case. The you hit me, I'll hit you back mentality has become the norm for the way we, as a society, tend to respond to disrespect. This way of thinking has become ingrained in the minds of our children and has resulted in the rash of school shootings and other acts of violence that are plaguing our nation today. Getting even is at the root of the problems, and we're going to talk about some roots here pretty soon, of verbal and physical abuse, murder, and suicide that occur on school property. Through character education, we can teach our students that there are ways to respond to disrespect other than retaliation, violence, and aggression. And so that's what we're, kind of our benchmark there, and the kind of the focus of what the teacher is going to be pushing towards as we move forward in this unit, this chapter. So let's look back to page lesson plan 5, page D. And this is in procedure 7, because this covers what we're going to be covering over the next day or so, day or two. And it says here, ask students in procedure 7, ask students to define a close relationship and to identify people with whom they have close relationships. Now, the answers will vary, but point out that elements of a close relationship include respect, trust, kindness, compassion, and affection. Friends and family members will fall into this category. And for the most part, it's going to be, mostly friends and family members. A lot of people, there are a lot of people who tend to, make friends pretty easily, right? They're very sociable. People like to be around them. They like to be around other people. Then you have people who have a little bit tighter circle of friends and associates, people that they associate with, that they can relate to. It doesn't mean that they don't like anybody else, but that's just their personality. Some people are a little more introverted and they're not comfortable, being in big crowds or having, 500 friends. They might just have a few close friends, 5 or 6, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But this is a part of what makes up a close relationship. And it's not always this outward affectionate show of compassion and affection and so forth. You see, like, with guys, we're a little more macho. We're not going around hugging each other and things like that all the time, and hanging on each other's shoulders and stuff like that. And it's a little bit different for men than it is for women, but we still have compassion, we still have care, and concern, for our male friends, right? It's just displayed in a different way, right? If something occurred to our buddy old pal and they fell down and got hurt, we drop everything to go run and help them, right? That's also a show of care and compassion and so forth. Sometimes we'll tell them. We might have to, get a little bit of, hey, don't go do that. That's also showing care and concern for them because they're getting ready to walk right into something that could be very dangerous to them. Okay, and so it's displayed in different ways, but the point is, these are the things that make up a close relationship. And then it says, tell students that even in close relationships, there can still be disrespect because people are not always conscientious of how they treat others. And, I want to say it's no fault of their own. It isn't until they're educated, because how do you know what to look for until you've been taught what to look for, right? I mean, you can't know to look for disrespect until you've been taught what disrespect is. Because if you've grown up in an environment where, it's a normal thing in your family, and I've seen this before, to be called stupid or a jerk, or special other names that we'd have to use bleeps in, that's I've seen families where that's a normal thing. The family members call each other B words and stupid and all these other names. And so for somebody who grew up in that environment, that doesn't necessarily seem disrespectful to them because that is how they talk to each other. Until somebody points it out and says, the way that you're speaking, is not respectful. Well, that's how we speak in my family. Well, I understand, but it's not respectful. And then as you slowly educate them and show them why and show them what they need to do to show respect, then eventually they'll understand and see your point that, respect is not shown by calling people names, by putting other people down and so forth. So those are some of the barriers, some of the walls that we have to keep dripping at. It seems like, as teachers, we're just a dripping faucet. As parents, they tell you the same thing over, and as a parent, it seems like that's just a part of parenting. Like the words that come out of our mouth are like that dripping drop of water, that sometimes falls on the hard heads of our children. But the hope is that, it'll break through and they'll get it. And for the most part, they do. I think of all of us here who have been in our homes or environments where we heard our parents tell us things over and over and over. And when we were younger, we were like, all right, here we go again, that was behind mom's back. Do not let her see you do that, otherwise you'd end up like that for the rest of your life. But eventually it clicked. we got it. We saw it. We understood it, right? And then we saw what our parents were saying, and then we had a value for it, okay? But had they not continually said those things over and over and over and over and over again, right? Then we might not have remembered it. It might not have ever broke through. But their words coming into our mind was like a seed being planted into the soil of our hearts and our minds. And it might have taken a while, right? But eventually the water got down deep enough and it started to sprout and take root and produce fruit. Now that's what comes with age and experience. Remember, experience is not always the best teacher, but sometimes it seems like you got to hit your head on a hard surface before it cracks open, and then you can get some get some light in there or some air in there to learn the lesson that you need to learn. It's better to learn by listening and practicing, the positive principles that we're learning in the Peaceful Solution. But sometimes it's a little bit too late. Remember, the Peaceful Solution is a preventative and an interventive type of program, to prevent you from making bad choices. But if you have made bad choices, this is what you need to do to fix them, okay? Because it's not too late for anybody. As long as you have breath, as long as you have life, you can change your character, change your heart and mind, and become a positive person, positive leader even. So it says, tell students that even in close relationships, there can still be disrespect because people are not always conscientious. That is, they're not paying attention, they're not aware of, right? When they're conscious about something, it's like when a person's unconscious, they don't know what's going on, right? They're closed. When you're sleeping, you're considered unconscious, right? Or when you black out, you're unconscious. So people are doing things, they're talking to you. I've talked to people when they're awake and then all of a sudden they're asleep and then you didn't realize you were just talking to yourself. But they don't hear a word you're saying, right? They're not aware of what's going on in their environment. They're not even aware of what they're doing. Have you ever been around a person who sleep talked? Right? Have you ever been around a person who sleepwalked? Now that's a little bit spooky to me, right? But they're not conscious of what they're doing. They're not conscious of the actions that are coming forth from them. Well, this is because they haven't been trained to be aware of, to look out for, right? To set their mind in advance, to know what's right and what's wrong. This comes with education. Well, once they're trained, then they can become conscious of the things that roll around in their mind, of the emotions that are taking place as a result of their thoughts, and then, catch it before it comes out of the mouth or before it comes forth from the hands or whatever the case might be. But they're not always conscious of how they treat others. Instruct students to write down 3 behaviors they consider disrespectful coming from a friend or family member. Discuss their answers and note the similarities and differences. And it says, have students read the sections when familiarity breeds contempt. And let's take a closer look at families. Those 2 sections there. And let's take a closer look at friends. So we have 3 sections there found on pages 128 through 131. Have students complete the exercise in the section Understanding the Main Point, found on page 132 of their handbooks. And for variation, these scenarios can be dramatized or acted out if you have the time and the opportunity to do that. It's a pretty enjoyable activity to have with your students as long as everyone practices self-control. And then discuss their answers as a class. So let's go back over here to page 128 there. Page 128, we'll pick up there. And look at the very top there in the box. It says here, everybody deserves respect. Those you know, as well as those who are strangers. Go the extra mile to keep interactions with all people respectful and pleasant. And that's something that's said quite a bit throughout the Peaceful Solution. Not just respectful, but pleasant as well, right? I mean, you can show respect, but not make an environment pleasant for someone to be in, okay? And this is why it says go the extra mile. Sometimes just putting a smile on your face, right? Or practicing being polite, saying thank you. Or, like William gave the example when he answered the person answers the phone and says, how can I help you have a great day? Or make your day better, or something like that. Just saying, hello or afternoon, or something like that, that would have been respectful. But then he went the extra mile to make it pleasant. And you saw how that influenced and helped him to feel great. Like, hey, I was doing pretty great already. Now, So going the extra mile, you'll learn in the peaceful solution that, and we're going to see here some of the basics. There's a difference here. You've got the basics, and then you've got the person who goes the extra mile, right? And there's nothing wrong with doing that to try to make things pleasant and enjoyable for others. Remember, when you think about it, just think about yourself, right? If you go to a class and you have a lot of things on your mind, and you're upset about some circumstances and some things that are taking place, you're stressed out, how much do you think you're going to get out of that class? Compared to going to the class and being excited to learn, having a smile on your face, and enjoying the company that you're with, right? When it's pleasant, it's like your pores are open, right, to receive all the beneficial. Now, not to say you wouldn't learn anything if you were upset, right? There might be something that the perfect thing that you could hear that could help you to deal with that problem. I'm not saying that you couldn't. But for the most part, when you're joyous and when you're peaceful, you're more receptive to learn things, okay? And this is why you got to be very careful about some of the influences that we covered in the past classes in the acceptance unit, particularly. We do all of them, but in the acceptance unit, we talked about the do-re-mis and the influences of television and music, because a lot of companies know if they can get you to be relaxed and get you to be excited, right, they can push whatever influence they want into your mind, because it becomes an open receptor. So be careful of the influences that are around you, because that is a very subtle technique to push negative influences into your mind. This is why we have to be on guard and be aware of our environment and the things that we're hearing or listening to or that are being presented to us. So it says here under when familiarity breeds contempt, okay? Now, if we look at, I think it's slide number 2, we're going to look at the definition of that word familiarity there. It says familiarity, now it's from the word familiar, and it is closely acquainted of or relating to a family. Now, if you look at the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 letters there, you kind of get that, family. It's not spelled with a Y, but you kind of get that idea, because, you people who are close to you, especially those who are really close to you, it's almost like they're family, right? There's an old saying that a true friend is closer to you than even a brother, But of or relating to a family, marked by informality, okay? Not this, pomp and pride, yes, no, sir, and this and that. No, you're kind of a little more relaxed. It also can mean overly free and unrestrained, which is what we're going to talk about here, and how we have to be very careful. Presumptuous is another definition. Presuming that you can act in a particular way, which could actually lead to disrespect if you're not careful. Having personal or intimate knowledge of, or intimate knowledge. And then at the bottom one there, it says, from the etymology of the word familiar, intimate, very friendly, on the family footing. From Old French familiare, related, friendly, from the Latin familiaris, domestic, private, belonging to a family, of a household, of or pertaining to one's family. Also of things known from long association, right? And then you see the last 2 at the very end there. It means also ordinary or usual, right? Ordinary or usual, because certain things can become normal. It can become an ordinary, or this is what we usually do because it's something that's done over and over, or even seeing particular patterns of behavior in people. That's how they usually act, or that's how they ordinarily act, right? Well, we're going to learn a little bit about, things we need to be aware of and what we need to guard from. And if you look at the next slide there, because I'm just breaking down this title here, familiarity breeds contempt. You see the word breed here, and it means, now it's got several meanings here, but it means to cause something to develop. Now remember, what we're working to develop here is a positive character. If we already had it, we wouldn't need to develop it, okay? And it's the same thing even with disrespect. In certain situations, people can become so complacent in their relationships with others. And you know how it is when you're around a person over a long period of time, you might start seeing certain character traits, and in a lot of cases it's really just personality traits that you really might not like very much, you know. One of the things that I don't really like is when people smack when they eat. It's like, you do have lips, right? You might want to keep those closed. You know? But it's not a cause to, you know, lash out and rage, you know. Would you close your mouth and eat? You know? Yeah, what is that going to cause? You know, people are going to get upset. They're not going to be able to digest their food. They're going to get heartburn, you know. You know, and so just because there's something that I don't like, because you don't notice that right away. You know, when you notice people, it's kind of like we talked about in the acceptance unit in the 4 steps of developing friendships and so forth. You know, everybody's, for the most part, they're on their best behavior. Right, they're on their best behavior. If you're around people, they'll just eat a little or whatever. And most people, some people, they don't really care. They'll kick back and, you know, burp and everything in your face. But most people, they're on their best behavior. It's when you get to know them and they become, like we just read in this definition here, you know, you become overly free and informal and unrestrained. Right, then that's when kind of people get loose and you start seeing things about their personality or character that you might not agree with very much, okay? So anyway, so when we get into this word breed here, to cause something to develop, notice to bring up, kind of like you breed or you bring up a person. And you see the next definition there is to train, right? It also is a type of person or thing, like a particular breed of animal. And so when we think about this, you know, I want us to think about this on a broader scale, because you know, we are working to breed positive character, so to speak, in our minds, in our offspring, so to speak. Not necessarily that our students are necessarily from us physically, but they are like our children. When we're teaching them, we're training them, right? We're wanting to breed a positive character within them so that they will be the type of person. Now we're talking about contempt here, but you can also breed positive, we're going to see here, character within a person as well. So it's a type of person or thing. And then under the next slide there, we see the definition for the word contempt. And it means, as a noun, the feeling that a person or a thing is beneath consideration, which means you're not going to show as much respect towards them as you should, because a part of the definition of respect includes consideration, okay? That a person is worthless or deserving scorn, disregard for something that should be taken into account, like when a teacher or a parent gives you instructions, right? And you decide not to do it, or you need to do your homework. I don't really care about school anyway. You need to clean your room. My room, I can keep it however I want to, right? Well, that's disregard for something that should be taken into account. You actually show contempt for your parents. And it says the offense of being disobedient to or disrespectful of a court of law and its officers. Now, I'm sure if you've ever watched Judge Judy or the People's Court or Judge Joe Brown or any one of those guys, you know, when people don't show respect to the court of law, which is the judge or any of the officers, the bailiffs, or anybody who has a position in that, they're in contempt. And there are consequences for being in contempt of court, right? Like fines and jail and so forth. So even in the court systems, right, you can't just disregard and act impulsively however you want to just because you feel, because there's consequences that come with that. There are in society as well. And then you look down here at the very bottom. This is another definition of contempt that is, now notice here, it's a pattern of attitudes and behavior. A pattern of attitudes and behavior. Now these things tie in also with our character, okay? A pattern of behavior, often towards an individual or group, but sometimes toward an ideology, which has the characteristics of disgust and anger. Okay, and this is what can be shown towards other people, and this is what we're talking about when we get into this lesson here of when familiarity breeds contempt. Now this is when it gets into this situation where it's disrespectful, because this is not a rule. Okay, this is not a rule that familiarity has to breed contempt and this is how you have to get out of it. No, it's not supposed to, right? This is when people let down their guards, or they're not practicing the peaceful solution, or haven't been taught the moral principles that would show respect, care, consideration, and concern for others, especially for those who are really close to them. Well, let's look at the very first paragraph there on page 128, and it says, although basic respect should be shown to all people, there should be an even greater degree of care and concern in close relationships, because you spend the most time with your family and friends. So now get that there. Although basic respect should be shown to all people. I want to go back here to page 8 here. Basic respect should be shown to all people. In other words, there's a certain just fundamental, foundational, we're going to see here in that word there, respect that should be shown to all people, right? Now, you're going to conduct yourself a little bit differently around your family, around your friends, around your teachers, and so forth, right? Some people, you might have a higher degree of respect for when you're in their presence. Nothing wrong with that. But everybody deserves a basic amount of respect. Let's look back to page 8 there, and we'll look at the very top. This is in our respect unit there. And notice here what it's saying. It's talking about appreciation of people. It says, you can show appreciation for all people by understanding that there is a fundamental value to life. And we're going to cover that definition again there. Keep in mind that appreciation is a part of respect, and it helps you to care for others and to treat them the way you would like to be treated. Now, here's a fundamental respect for all people, and it says it's shown when we avoid violent verbal and physical behavior. Now, this ties right into what we're going to be talking about here in familiarity, breeding contempt, interact with consideration of others' needs, and accept that people are unique and have different beliefs and values. And then it gives two examples here of how someone can demonstrate fundamental respect for all life, where Charles, passed a homeless man and he mentioned it to his counselor and they got the man some help. And then another example where Bill passed the homeless man and he played tricks on him, and he didn't show a fundamental level of respect for the homeless man. And at the very bottom there, well, not the very bottom, but underneath the examples there, on page 8, it says, from these two scenarios, it is clear to see that basic respect must be shown to all people, regardless of their circumstances, whether they're a part of your family, whether they're not part of your family, whether they're the new person at school, the new person at work, right? The youngest sibling that you have, or the oldest sibling that you have, or your family member, whatever the case might be, or a friend that you might have known since kindergarten. It doesn't matter. Or the stranger that you just met. Regardless of their circumstances, no one deserves to be ridiculed or treated cruelly. And if you look over to page 9 there, you see the basic rules for respecting all people. Now, obviously, when these things are broken and they're not regarded, you get into the situation that we're going to be covering here on page 128, when familiarity breeds contempt. So on page 9 at the bottom there, it says basic rules for all people, for respecting all people, we have always remember that people have value, and I put all there in between there. All people have value and must be respected. Because, and then we have the 3 points here, they are living, breathing members of the human race or the human society. They have goals, abilities, and potential, even if they don't realize their own potential, even if they don't realize their own abilities, they still have them. Sometimes they just need a person with patience and care and consideration to kind of draw that out of them and to show them that they do have value. Sometimes people don't even realize their own value, right? And then lastly there it says they can build a positive character and be productive members of society. And then at the very bottom it says each person has goals, desires, and the potential to contribute something of value to the needs of others, of course, if they're taught. All right, so we see here basic respect should be shown to all people. There should be an even greater degree of care and concern in close relationships because you spend the most time with your family and friends. And if you look at the next slide there we have a definition here of basic as an adjective. It's forming an essential. Now remember what we covered in the Peaceful Solution, because we covered the definition of this word essential before. An essential simply means absolutely necessary. It's absolutely necessary or extremely important. So when we look at this word basic, we can't just look at it and brush it off to the side, because within the definition of basic, it's telling you that what you're learning in these principles in regards to showing respect for others is extremely important. Right? We also see that it is the foundation. It is the foundation, of course, of building a positive, having positive, healthy relationships, positive, healthy interactions with others, with your family, with your friends, and even with a complete stranger. But notice, it's a foundation, or it's a starting point, right? You kind of look at, and we'll see an example here in a little bit, but you have kind of a basic learning that you might start off with, and then kind of like what we start even with the Peaceful Solution. We don't call it the basic, but it's the beginners, or the elementary, right? But that's what you get. That's where you get your basics. You get your foundation, right? In Peaceful Solution, it's ownership, respect, asking, self-control, and honesty. In school, it's reading, writing, and arithmetic. You learn your ABCs, because if you don't know your ABCs, you're not going to be able to form words. If you can't form words, you're not going to be able to read. You're not going to be able to write. You learn your basics of your numbers, and so you can understand math and so forth. And you kind of get your basic fundamentals and foundation for all the rest of the knowledge that you're going to be building later on in life. But it's a foundation or starting point. And notice there it's fundamental, because we use also this word in the Peaceful Solution as well regarding respect. Now, something that's fundamental is a central or primary rule or principle on which something is based. So when we're talking about respect, right, the primary rule or principle is treating others with consideration, care, and concern. And then there's things that we don't do. Things we do and things we don't do. And when we follow those rules, or we stay within that boundary, then we're safe, right? And we're building positive relationships. We're building respect for ourselves. We're building a positive reputation, and we're building others up. Now, as a noun, this word basic is, remember nouns, person, place, or thing, the essential facts or principles, which are rules, of a subject or a skill. The essential facts or principles or rules of a subject or a skill. Now remember, that's something that a person has to do in order to get to this point where they're showing respect, is they've got to get the facts. And the only way they get the facts is to get the knowledge, get the information, to come to the classes, to read the books, and then put these things into practice so that they can start to demonstrate them when they interact with other people. Because remember, as we learned before, society, and just not even society in general, but just spending time with your friends, right? Spending time with your family is going to test your resolve to practice the things you've learned in the Peaceful Solution. But that's fine, right? How do you know that you've gotten a principle down packed unless you've been tested? How do you know that you're patient, that you'll be respectful when someone's showing you disrespect, that you'll practice self-control when something takes place that you might be really excited about or you might be really angry about. How do you know? Unless you're put to the test, right? Well, that's what those situations, those real life situations are for. But you got to get the facts, and then you have to be trained. Now, I have a physical example for you to see here. If anybody's ever purchased or been in the car there, that's my next slide there. You've got like this, it's like a 2010 or 2015 Toyota Corolla there. You got your base model there, right? Now, if anybody, you remember back in the day when we bought, at least coming from Ohio up north, you know, when you got a base model, I remember back in the day you can get, I think it was Ford used to run specials that you can get like for like $6,995. You can get into a Ford Escort or a Ford Ranger, right? And it was the base model. You know, you got manual windows, manual everything, AM, FM radio, no cassette, no air conditioner, just a heater. Up north, it wasn't really that big of a thing, you know. Manual steering, not even power steering, and manual transmission, okay? They didn't even put the premium air in the tires back in the day. And you got your base model. But you don't disregard that, because that base model still gives you the fundamentals in order for you to get in that vehicle and get from point A to point B in a safe manner. It still had seat belts, right? It still had brakes. It still had turn signals. Even though it was the basic, right, it still gave you the fundamentals in order to drive that vehicle in a safe manner on the public roads. Well, it's the same thing. The basics gives us what we need in order to have healthy, respectful, positive interactions with others, even with people we don't meet. Now, you look at the next slide there, you got the premium or the greater degree model, like we read there. There should be an even greater degree of care and concern with those who we're in close relationships with, right? This is where you pull out your power windows, your cruise control, you know, your power steering, your automatic transmission, you know, maybe a little bit more go-go juice under the hood or whatever, premium wheels. Well, this is how we interact with one another, right? You know, we might do a little bit extra things for one another, you know, with a close family member or a friend, you know, when they're feeling down, you know, we might, you know, give them a pat on the shoulder or something like that and say, hey, man, it's going to be all right. You know, you wouldn't do that to a total stranger. You know, they might not want to be touched, right? Plus, you don't just go around touching people nowadays, you know, and so we do different things, still showing respect, but a greater degree for our family and our friends, okay? And remember, in keeping everything in line with what we talked in the Peaceful Solution talked about in regards to proper touch and so forth. But you have this greater degree of care and concern in close relationships because you spend the most time with your family and friends. And I want to go back here to the acceptance unit there. Let's see here. I think it's page 53 because we're talking about relationships here. On page 53 of the acceptance unit, we talk about building relationships. And it says here, building relationships. A relationship is built when mutual interactions, now this is both parties agreeing, right? When both parties agree to interact with another. Mutual interactions connect two or more people as belonging or working together. Although there are many types of relationships, they all result from communication and interaction. Now, this is where the disrespect can even come in with close friends and families, right? How we communicate with each other, how we interact with each other. Are we taking things that don't belong to them just because they're our younger sibling, right? Are we taking somebody for granted just because we've known them for years? Those are our interactions. How are we communicating? Are we talking to them a little bit more disrespectfully, you know, because we've known them forever? Man, that's why you're so stupid, man, you know? And how do you think that would build up your friend? How would you be considered as a friend if you're putting someone down just because you know them? But they all result from communication and interaction. Some relationships are personal, like we're talking about here, while others are professional. A personal relationship involves two or more people who know each other well and are comfortable, that was part of that definition with familiarity there, around each other. These relationships you share with your family and close friends are examples of personal relationships. A professional relationship is more formal. For example, the relationships you share with your teacher or boss are examples of professional relationships. Now, whether you're aware of it or not, this is under rules. All relationships, both professional and personal, have rules or guidelines that govern behavior and interactions. All right? And when those rules are broken, then you get this contempt within the family or within any relationship. Skipping down here, it says, when rules that govern personal relationships are compromised, the result is also abuse that could range from verbal to physical and sexual. Sexual behavior between family members, for example, is not only immoral but also devastating. And of course, it violates that bond, for a person to have a healthy environment to grow up in. Of course, Chapter 2 of the Character Unit goes more into detail about that. Now, continuing here, back on page 128, we're still in the first paragraph, second part. It says, respectful interactions demonstrate genuine concern for the well-being of others, which makes life, now notice here again, you see that word, more pleasant. It makes life more pleasant when these interactions are respectful. Let's look down to the second paragraph. Now, sadly here, this is kind of the meat of what we're talking about, there is a tendency to disrespect those we are close to, yet treat strangers in a kind and courteous manner. Do you know someone who is very respectful to their friends' parents, but are rude and argumentative to their own parents? Right? I knew people like that growing up. People who would even say, I wish that I was in such and such family. I hate this family, And all because their parents were trying to instill a little bit of responsibility in them, trying to instill a little bit of respect in them, they were doing the best that they could to try to instill certain morals in the mind of the child, right? But because the child didn't want to clean their room, because they didn't want to do their homework, because they didn't want to mow the lawn, because they didn't want to babysit their sibling for an hour while their parents went to the grocery store or something like that, they hated their parents. And it was always funny, because I think we've probably been in those situations. Our parents could tell us one thing, you really should work hard and study so that you can, become successful in life. Like you are, right? You're real successful, mom or dad or whoever the case might be. And then you're over there, oh, hi, Mr. Jones, hi, Mrs. Jones. Hey, Tommy, you really should study so you can become successful in life. Oh, you're right. That's right. You're absolutely right. I'm going to study hard. Two sets of parents are telling you the exact same thing. But because there's contempt for your own family, you disregard what one person says and listen to what the other person says, right? Remember, we talk about being consistent in the development of a positive character, right? If we're not doing this over and over and over, that is, upholding this principle of morality and respect, then we're not a person of integrity, right? We're not a person who truly is or has or deserves a respectful reputation. Because you can't be respectful to Billy's parents and be disrespectful to your own parents when you get home, okay? You're not being consistent. So it says here, should have brought my glasses. Do you know someone who is disrespectful to their parents who is very respectful to their parents but are rude and argumentative to their own parents, or someone who is polite to guests but to their siblings they are impolite? Here's the bottom line. Familiarity should never breed disrespect. Rather, it should breed greater consideration, care, and concern. Why? Because we get to know the person a little bit better. And like William covered, about in the last class, when we understand people and their background, that gives us a little bit more insight into why they make certain decisions. So even with their family, us being trained in the peaceful solution, it should give us a little bit more insight why they might smack your food, or why they might, kind of have a cloud over their head all the time, and give us more of an incentive to treat them with even more care and concern, to be an example to them, maybe to be a little ray of sunshine or a rainbow in their life, so that they could have something to look forward to, right? Two wrongs don't make a right, right? And when somebody's negative or have a bad attitude, being negative and have a bad attitude is not going to bring a positive environment in that home. Okay, so these are some of the things we're going to talk about. We're going to stop right there. We're going to pick up. We're not quite finished with that paragraph there on page 128, but we'll pick up back up on 128 for our next class, which is going to be Wednesday, 6/21, and it'll be at 5:30 Central Standard Time. Again, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next class. We hope you have a wonderful evening.